Welcome to Phrase by Phrase, where we are studying the Bible one phrase at a time. And today we are looking at James chapter 1, verse 15, part A. James says, "Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin." We're in this ongoing study where we're looking at the nature of temptation, and today is the conditional nature of temptation. The lust has to be conceived, and that gives birth to sin. So temptation alone is not sin. There's a condition, and that is conception. But the question is, what constitutes conception? I mean, certainly acting upon the temptation is, but Jesus took it even further into the realm of motive and thought. In Matthew 5:22, he said, "You've heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit adultery, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever is angry with his brother and says you good for nothing shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says you fool shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." And then he says in verse 27, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So he's talking about motives and intents of the heart and decisions of the will even before an action is carried out. So there's this internal agreement with the temptation that precedes the act, and this inner acquiescence, this internal yes, is the same as doing it. And that's why temptation is an internal battle. The mind, the will, and the emotion are all attacked in temptation. In fact, the will is going to be the thing that decides to do it. But the more important point in the battle is not with the will, it's with the mind and the emotions. In fact, if you could look at your life as a three-legged stool, temptation often comes against all three legs, and those three legs would be the mind, the will, and the emotion. And so I want to think about those for just a moment. Let's say the first leg represents the mind. Temptation comes against the mind, and often the attack is twofold. The aim is to get us to doubt the Word of God, and it's also to get us to believe that we can gain some personal advantage outside of God. That's what the serpent did with Eve. And so the mind is attacked through deception and through moving us away from the cover of God's truth. The second leg of attack is to attack the emotions. And James said, or not James, but John said that this happens through the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the boastful pride of life. We looked at that verse just a couple of studies ago. But here the tool is enticement. The things of the world are placed in our path to lure us into a trap. And then the third leg is the assault against the will. When we fall to temptation, when our will caves in, sometimes it feels like we're not even running our own lives. We do the deed, whatever that would be, and we can't believe that we did it. You know, have you ever experienced those moments when on the other side of temptation, you can't believe how stupid you were? Like, I wasn't in my right mind. I wasn't thinking correctly. What got over me that I did that thing? And that's because when we're in the midst of temptation, it's as if your mind shuts down and what's called the reptilian brain kicks in, which we'll look at a little bit later. And it takes control so that we're not in our right mind in a sense. And so there's good news and there's bad news in this. The good news is that nobody can force your will. You alone have the power of the will to choose what you are going to do and are not going to do. But the bad news is that once the leg of the mind is tripped, in other words, we're given to deception, we're vulnerable to caving into the temptation, because here's what happens. It's intended for the will to be the rudder of our lives, to set the direction for what we will do and how we will behave. But God has designed us so that the will receive instruction from the mind. But when the mind is deceived and that leg of the stool is knocked out, then what's left is for the emotion to influence the will. And the emotion is easily enticed. The emotion can't really be trusted. And so that leaves the will vulnerable. And so once the leg of the mind is knocked out and the leg of the emotion is knocked out, even though we're the ones who still have to decide to enact the will, it's almost impossible at that point for us to stop ourselves, and so we cave. And here's what happens with people when they think about fighting temptation. They think the battle is at the point of the will, and they muster all their forces to fight against that third leg of the will, not realizing that by the time they get there, once the other two legs are knocked out, it's pretty much a done deal. And so the battle really has to be in the mind, all right? So the way that it's conceived is through the will, but the channel to the will is the mind. So the battle is always in the mind. I hope to tell you some more about this as we study again. And so I'll see you next time as we study the Bible, phrase by phrase.